No one was ever supposed to know this. It was a secret buried in red clay and mountain shadow. A story whispered away by the wind through the pines. It was hidden for over 200 years until now. There are photographs, you see, clinical black and white images that feel like they're staring back at you. Images that doctors have argued should be burned, not just for the sake of human dignity, but for the sake of human sanity. In a forgotten corner of rural Virginia back in 1971, a 17-year-old girl gave birth to something that shattered every known law of biology. What were we never meant to know about the child born in that room? The secret wasn't just that. Its bloodline was tangled. The secret was that it was designed. For 6 days, the world held its breath without even knowing it as a living, breathing impossibility lay in a hospital incubator. And when the truth of its origin was finally pieced together, the file wasn't just closed. It was classified at a level reserved for national threats. The story begins not with the child, but with the blood. A legacy of isolation so profound, so absolute that it became a laboratory. A human experiment conducted not by scientists in white coats, but by a family convinced they were touching the face of God. They called it preserving the pure line. The rest of the world that was never meant to find out, would have called it by a much darker name. They were building something generation by generation, piece by agonizing piece. And that October morning, their work was finally born. The name on the census records was Whitaker. Joshua Whitaker, 1847. He claimed 200 acres of unforgiving mountain land in Roanoke County, a place other settlers actively avoided. The land wasn't for farming. It was for disappearing. The soil was thin and sour. The winters were a relentless siege of ice and wind. And the nearest town was a 3-day ride through terrain that could break a man's spirit or his ankle with equal indifference. But Joshua wasn't seeking a new life. He was seeking a fortress. In the deep shadowed hollers, where the morning mist clings to the ridges like a shroud, refusing to burn off even at noon, the Whitaker family began their great and terrible work. He arrived not with one wife, but 2. There was Martha, his legal spouse, and her younger sister, Rebecca. He called her a companion, a frontier term that provided just enough cover for the local preacher to bless both unions in a single hurried ceremony. By 1855, the mountain was alive with the cries of 14 children. All born of one man and 2 sisters. But this is where the path diverges from the simple story of frontier hardship into something else entirely. As those 14 children grew into men and women, their eyes didn't turn towards the distant lights of town, towards the sons and daughters of other families. They turned toward each other. In the suffocating isolation of their mountain kingdom, a new law was written, not in a book, but in blood. A law that said the outside world was a contagion, and the only salvation was to keep the circle closed. Forever. We found his journals. Decades later, hidden beneath the routed floorboards of the original homestead. The pages were brittle. The ink faded to a ghostly brown. But the words were of fire. Joshua Whitaker wasn't just an eccentric farmer. He was a philosopher, a prophet of his own twisted gospel. He wrote, "The blood of man has been thinned by the mingling of nations. It is a pale and watery thing. But in our veins runs the memory of the first fire, the uncorrupted essence. To mix it is to profane it. To keep it pure is the only true worship." He convinced his children of this. He didn't just teach it. He breathed it into them until it became the very air in their lungs. They were not merely a family. They were a chosen people, guardians of a sacred genetic flame. The outside world was a sea of corruption and their mountain was the ark. And so the first generation married, brother to sister, cousin to cousin. By the 1880s, the Whitaker family tree was no longer a tree at all. It had become a wreath, a knot, a serpent eating its own tail. It was a closed loop, a perfect horrifying circle. The branches that should have reached for the sun instead curled back inward, grafting themselves onto the trunk again and again and again, creating a structure that was dense, dark, and utterly impenetrable from the outside. They were building a new kind of human, and they were willing to sacrifice anything and anyone to see it finished. The children born from these unions, they were different. It's a word you hear whispered in the fragmented accounts from that time. Neighbors, the few who lived within a day's ride, spoke of the Whittaker folk in hushed, fearful tones. They talked about the children who never cried, but made soft, guttural sounds like birds trapped in a chimney. Children who walked with a strange lurching gait, as if the ground itself was uneven beneath their feet. But it was their eyes that people remembered most. They were often a pale, washed-out blue, and they held an emptiness that was profoundly unsettling. They didn't seem to look at you, but through you, as if you were a ghost in their world, not the other way around. After 1890, local doctors simply refused to make the journey up the mountain for a Whittaker birth. One old physician, Dr. Alistair Finch, wrote in a letter to his brother, "I have delivered babies born without limbs and babies born with two heads. I have seen the coolest tricks nature can play, but I will not go to that house again. What is being born up there is not of God. The family is cursed, and they embrace their curse as a blessing." But the Whittakers didn't see a curse. They saw progress. With each new child born with a club foot, a cleft palate, or a silent vacant stare, the family elders would nod and say, "The blood is getting stronger. The vessel is changing to hold it." They believed they were purifying their line, burning away the genetic dross of the outside world, approaching an ideal that no one else was brave enough to even imagine. By the turn of the 20th century, the Whittaker bloodline had become a biological paradox. What began as a rigid ideology had by necessity evolved into a chillingly complex system. The simple unions of siblings and cousins were no longer sufficient to concentrate the bloodline at the rate the elders desired. The family journals from this period are filled with meticulous, terrifyingly precise charts and diagrams. They had developed what they called the rotation system. It was a carefully planned schedule, a human breeding program more sophisticated than any found in agriculture. Each fertile woman in the family was assigned a sequence of male partners. She would bear a child to her brother one year, her uncle the next, her own father the year after that. The goal was to create offspring with the most densely interwoven genetics possible, to layer relationship upon relationship until the very concepts of parent, child, and sibling dissolved into a single unified identity. They kept records not of names, but of genetic contributions, treating human life as a series of calculated inputs in a generations-long equation. They weren't just a family anymore. They had become a self-contained, self-referential biological system. And the children born from this system were living proof of its horrifying success. They were becoming less and less like the people in the towns below and more like something new, something the mountain was creating in its own dark image. Charity Whittaker, Sarah May's grandmother, was born in 1925. She was in many ways the masterpiece of the rotation system. Her birth certificate, had one ever been filed, would have been an impossible document. She was the product of a union between her mother and 3 different men, all occurring within the same fertile cycle, according to the family's own deranged record-keeping. The father was her grandfather's brother, and her own uncle. Genetically, she was a Gordian knot. Decades later, when a blood sample was finally obtained and analyzed, the results were so anomalous that the lab technicians threw them out, assuming the sample was contaminated. They ran it again and again. The results were always the same. Charity's DNA contained patterns that defied Mendelian genetics. She was simultaneously her mother's daughter, her own first cousin, her own niece, and her own aunt. Her chromosomes told a story of such profound and repeated genetic folding that she should not have been viable, but she was. She survived. And within the twisted, insular world of the Whittaker compound, she thrived. She was raised on the family gospel, taught from birth that the outside world was populated by mongrels and deluded souls. She was told that her own unique genetic heritage was a sign of nobility, a mark of her closeness to the perfect circle. The family was striving to create. By 15, she was chosen to continue the great work. She was pregnant with her first child, fathered by her own father, a man who was also her uncle and her cousin. That child's name was Thomas. And he would grow up to become Sarah May's father. Honestly, what would you do if you were born into a world where every rule you were taught, every truth you held sacred was a grotesque inversion of reality? For the children of the Whittaker clan, the term family had lost all its conventional, meaning. It wasn't a tree with branches. It was a single thick column of blood. Children grew up without the simple anchors of mother, father, brother, or sister. Those words were used, but they were fluid, interchangeable. A man could be your father, your brother, and your uncle all at once. A woman could be your mother and your cousin. These distinctions, so fundamental to the rest of the world, had been deliberately erased. In their place was a single all-encompassing identity, the bloodline. They spoke of it as a living entity, a conscious force. They would say, "The blood calls to blood," a phrase used to justify every forbidden union. They believed each new generation, each new child born from this ever-tightening circle brought them one step closer to what their founder Joshua had called the divine form, a state of genetic purity so absolute that it would unlock abilities latent in the human species, powers of the mind, resilience to disease, a connection to the earth that the deluded mongrels of the world had lost. By the 1960s, when Sarah May was born, the experiment had been running for over a century. The family was a nation of one. They had their own dialect, a strange, lealing version of Appalachian English peppered with words of their own invention. They had their own religion, a worship of their own genetic code, and they guarded their terrible secret with a ferocity that was absolute. That secret was about to be made flesh. Sarah May Wicker was 17 when she knew this pregnancy was different. This wasn't her first. By the brutal calculus of the family, she had been a woman since she was 12. She had given birth at 14 and again at 16. Both children were born silent. Tiny misshapen things that gasped for a few moments before falling still. The family elders didn't mourn these deaths. They called them offerings to the blood, necessary failures on the path to success. They would bury the infants in unmarked graves in the woods, whispering prayers for the vessel that had failed, but giving thanks for the purity of the attempt. But this time was different. Sarah May could feel it. The life inside her didn't move like the others. There were no gentle kicks, no soft rolls. She described it to her mother as a feeling of trapped lightning. It wasn't a flutter. It was a pulse, a low, rhythmic thrumming that vibrated through her bones and made her teeth ache. It felt less like a child and more like a machine. Something utterly alien waking up inside her. Her belly grew at an alarming rate, stretching the skin over her small frame until it was thin and translucent, a pale nap of dark writhing veins. The family was not concerned. They were ecstatic. The elders gathered around her, placing their hands on her stomach, their eyes wide with a terrifying, feverish hope. "This is the one," they would whisper. "The culmination, the perfect circle is closing." They began to prepare. Rituals that hadn't been performed in a generation were revived. They were preparing to welcome their Messiah. But as they celebrated, Sarah May was wasting away. The pregnancy wasn't just growing inside her. It was consuming her. She was a vessel being drained to feed the impossible life she carried. In the final trimester, she lost over 40 pounds. Even as her abdomen swelled to a grotesque size, her face became gaunt, her skin taking on a gray waxy color. Her hair, once thick and brown, fell out in clumps, leaving bald patches on her scalp. Her teeth loosened in her gums, and several fell out while she ate the thin broth her mother fed her. But the most disturbing change was in her eyes. They had been a deep, soulful brown. Now they were changing color. Slowly, day by day, they shifted to a pale jaundiced yellow. And at night, in the dim light of the cabin's oil lamps, her family swore they glowed with a faint internal luminescence. The elders saw these horrifying symptoms not as signs of illness, but as proof of a divine transformation. They believed the child was rewriting her very being, purifying her from the inside out, preparing her to be the mother of a new kind of being. Medical experts who would later review the scant records of her condition recognized the signs immediately. It was a case of acute genetic toxicity. The fetus she was carrying was so genetically aberrant, its cellular structure so alien that her own body was treating it as a poison, a massive growing tumor. Her immune system had collapsed and her organs were failing. She was being devoured by her own child. When she finally went into labor on October 13, 1971, she hadn't been conscious for 3 days. It was this and only this that prompted the family to break their most sacred rule. They needed a witness. They wanted medical documentation of the miracle they were about to receive. They carried her down the mountain, never imagining they were carrying their darkest secret into the light. If you've come this far, comment, the truth bleeds through below. You're not just watching this story. You're becoming part of the unearthing. Dr. Margaret Powell was the chief of obstetrics at Mercy General, a small underfunded hospital 30 miles from the base of the Whitakers Norton. In her 20-year career, she thought she had seen everything. She had delivered conjoined twins, anencefalic babies, children with their organs on the outside of their bodies. She was a veteran of the cruelties of birth. But when the Whitaker clan carried Sarah May's limp, emaciated body through the emergency room doors, pet primal instinct flared in Dr. Powell. This was different. The family themselves were a shocking sight. Tall, gaunt figures with the same pale, vacant eyes, moving with a silent, synchronized purpose that was deeply unnerving. They didn't ask for help. They demanded an audience. The father Thomas, a man who looked both 50 and 25 at the same time, spoke in a low, growly voice. "She is delivering the culmination," he said, not to the doctor, but to the room at large. "We require a record." Dr. Powell and her team rushed Sarah May to the delivery ward. Her vital signs were catastrophic. Her body was racked with contractions so violent they had already shattered 2 of her ribs. The medical team tried to hook her up to a fetal monitor, but the readings made no sense. The machine designed to track the steady thump-thump of a human heart registered chaotic, irregular clusters of electrical activity. It looked more like a seismograph reading during an earthquake than a cardiac signature. A young nurse named Patricia Williams, her face pale, later testified in a sealed deposition that the sound coming from the amplified monitor wasn't a heartbeat. It sounded, she swore, like whispering. The birth took 14 hours. 14 hours of hell. Sarah May never regained consciousness. Her body a battlefield for a war it had already lost. For Dr. Powell and her 2 nurses, the room began to feel like a space outside of normal reality. The air grew thick, heavy, a strange whispering. Static from the fetal monitor was a constant, unnerving presence. The Whitaker family stood just outside the door, not speaking, just waiting, their collective gaze at palpable pressure on the other side of the wall. 3 times during the labor, a nurse had to leave the room, overcome with a dizzying sense of nausea and dread that had no medical explanation. The 3rd nurse simply walked out of the hospital and never returned. Dr. Powell, a woman of science and pragmatism, found herself fighting against a rising tide of primal fear. The instruments behaved erratically. Lights flickered. At one point, a steel tray of surgical tools vibrated off its stand and crashed to the floor, startling everyone. And through it all, the rhythmic whispering pulse from within Sarah May's womb continued, a sound that seemed to be counting down to something terrible. Then, in the final moments, just before the child emerged, a profound silence fell over the room. The monitor flatlined. The whispering stopped. For a single terrifying second, drive. Powell thought both mother and child were gone. And then it came. And the world, for the few people in that room, would never be the same. The silence wasn't the silence of death. It was the silence of awe. A holy, terrible awe. What drive? Powell saw in her hands defied every law of anatomy, every principle of biology she had ever learned. It was a mockery of the human form, a living sculpture of genetic chaos. The infant was alive, that much was certain. It breathed in shallow, rattling gasps. Its heartbeat, a frantic, irregular rhythm. Its eyes moved, but it was wrong. It was all so terribly wrong. The head was the first thing that broke her composure. It was enormous, nearly twice the size of a normal newborn's, and the skull was so thin and translucent that the brain was visible beneath the skin. But it wasn't a brain, not a single folded organ. It appeared to be a cluster of dozens of smaller grayish lobes, each one pulsing with its own independent, sickening rhythm. Its limbs were a nightmare of fusion and malformation. The arms emerged from the torso, not at the shoulders, but from the chest, and they were twisted, ending in hands that had no thumbs, only a spiral of 7 or 8 long, delicate fingers. The legs were even worse. They were wound around each other like two thick vines, inseparable, and they ended not in feet, but in two small, perfectly formed faces, tiny doll-like faces, with eyes that blinked and mouths that opened and closed in silent constant motion. But the true horror was the main face, or rather the faces. There were 3 of them layered and overlapping on the massive head like a series of photographic double exposures. One central face and 2 others flanking. It partially merged, sharing a single weeping eye here, a nostril there, and all 3 mouths were stretched open in a permanent silent scream. 3 doctors walked out of that delivery room. 1, a young resident named Drive. Peters vomited in the hallway, resigned from his position the next day and according to hospital records never practiced medicine again. He just disappeared. The child was alive, but was it human? That was the question that hung in the sterile silent air of the neonatal unit. Did it deserve the protection of medical ethics? Or was its very existence an act of cruelty? Dr. Powell, shaking but resolute, made a decision that would haunt her and define the rest of her life. She would keep it alive. Her motive was in compassion, not in the traditional sense. It was a cold, terrifying scientific curiosity. What was this thing? What were the limits of life? How could something so fundamentally broken continue to draw a breath? For 6 days, the staff of Mercy General Hospital became the reluctant zookeepers of a creature from a nightmare. The child, officially designated Infant Doe Whitaker, never cried. It made no sound that resembled a human vocalization. Instead, it emitted a low, constant hum, a sound that nurses described as feeling like static electricity on their skin. The multiple eyes on its 3 faces move independently of one another, tracking different people and objects around the room with a focused, unnerving intelligence that seemed utterly impossible given the malformed, pulsating cluster of organs. Inside its skull, it was aware. That was the part that truly terrified them. It was aware, and it was watching. The Whitaker family kept a constant fidget. They were not allowed in the neonatal intensive care unit, but they stood in the hallway outside the glass day and night. Their tall gaunt frames casting long shadows under the fluorescent lights. They didn't seem to sleep or eat. They just stood and watched and waited. When a nurse would pass, they would ask in their strange flat dialect, as the culmination well. They showed no horror at the child's appearance. On the contrary, they showed a profound, unsettling reverence. Through the glass, they would speak to it, their voices low and rhythmic. They sang to it haunting minor key melodies that had no recognizable lyrics, but seemed to calm the child's agitated movements. The humming sound it produced would often synchronize with their singing, creating a bizarre, discordant harmony that made the nurse's hair stand on end. They brought offerings, objects from their mountain home that the staff were ordered to keep outside the unit. There were gnarled pieces of wood polished by countless hands until they shone. There were stones arranged in complex spiral patterns on the hallway floor. And there were photographs, faded sepia-1 pictures of their ancestors. And in those photos, a trained eye could see the story. Generation by generation, you could see the faces changing, the eyes getting wider, the jaws becoming more pronounced, a subtle creeping alteration of the human form, all leading to this thing in the incubator. They called it the perfect one, and they worshipped it with a faith that was as pure as it was insane. The child was dying, but its death was as unnatural as its life. Standard medical procedure for infants with such severe deformities would anticipate a cascade of organ failure, a shutdown of the heart, lungs, kidneys. But this child wasn't failing. It was dissolving. Dr. Powell documented the process in a private log book which was later confiscated. She wrote, "The subject's cellular integrity appears to be unstable. Tissue is not necessing breaking down at a molecular level. Dark patches are appearing on the skin, but they are not bruises. They are windows. I can see the internal structures turning to a dark viscous fluid." The process which should have been agonizing seemed to have the opposite effect. As its body broke down, the child grew calmer. The frantic independent movements of its many eyes slowed, and for the first time they seemed to focus in unison. The 3 faces, which had been locked in that silent, constant scream for 5 days, began to relax, the mouths closed. The expression softened into something that looked disturbingly like peace. It was as if the child's brief monstrous existence in our physical world was a painful ordeal, and its dissolution was a welcome release, a return to some other state of being. On the morning of the 6th day, the night nurse, Patricia Williams, went to perform the routine check. She stopped dead in the doorway, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle the scream. The humming had stopped. The incubator was silent, but the child was still alive, its chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. During the night, it had somehow rearranged itself. Its fused limbs, its twisted torso, its impossibly heavy head. It had coiled its entire body into a perfect geometric spiral, a pattern that defied its own anatomy. And with what looked like a serene smile on each of its 3 faces, it drew one final breath and was gone. The government descended within hours. Not local police, not state health officials, federal agents. They arrived in black, unmarked sedans that glided into the hospital parking lot with an unnatural silence. Men in dark, impeccably tailored suits who moved with an efficiency that was both impressive and terrifying. They didn't flash badges from the FBI or the CIA. They carried credentials from an agency no one on the hospital staff had ever heard of, something called the Office of Genetic Security. They said they were from the CDC investigating a potential genetic contagion, but drive. Powell knew that was a lie. These men weren't doctors or scientists. They were something else. They were custodians of secrets. They confiscated everything. A child's body was sealed in a specialized lead-lined container and taken away. All of Sarah May's medical records, every chart, every lab result, every doctor's note was seized. They took Drive, Powell's private log book. They took the photographs the family had brought, the strange wooden totems, the stones they had arranged in the hallway. They even took the fetal monitor that had recorded the whispering heartbeat, sealing it in an evidence bag. Every single staff member who had seen the child or the family was taken into a private room and debriefed for hours. At the end, they were made to sign thick stacks of non-disclosure agreements, documents bound by the National Security Act, legally forbidding them from ever speaking a word of what they had witnessed under penalty of treason. The official death certificate was a masterpiece of bureaucratic obfuscation. Cause of death, multiple congenital anomalies. The child was erased. It had never existed. Sarah May Whitaker died 3 days after her child. She never woke up. Her body ravaged and poisoned by the pregnancy. Simply gave out her death. Certificate listed complications from childbirth. Another clean, simple lie to cover an impossible truth. The Whitaker family took her body back up the mountain. They were given the falsified death certificate for their perfect one and they vanished. They retreated back into the shadows of their isolated kingdom, their century-long experiment, having culminated in a brief 6-day flash of horrifying glory before being swallowed by the state. In the years that followed, local authorities, spurred by rumors that refused to die, attempted to make contact with the family. They would drive up the winding dirt road to the CO mound only to find it silent and seemingly abandoned. The cabins were there, the windows dark and empty, but there was no sign of life. Yet hunters and hikers in the surrounding woods told strange stories. They spoke of hearing faint, high-pitched singing in the forests on moonless nights. They reported seeing tall, thin figures moving through the trees at dusk, always just at the edge of their vision. The Whitakers were gone from the world, but the mountain still held them. They had become ghosts, a local legend, their true story. Locked away in a government vault hundreds of miles away. A story that was never supposed to be told. But secrets like water always find a way out, even if it takes 50 years. The files were declassified in 2021, not with a press conference or a public announcement, but with a quiet digital upload to a forgotten corner of a government archive server. It was a data dump buried among thousands of other newly declassified documents designed to be overlooked. Almost no one noticed, but someone did. A small group of independent researchers, geneticists, and historians who had heard whispers of the Whitaker baby for decades, who had been hunting for this file, finally found it. And the truth it contained was far more disturbing than any rumor. The child's DNA was a Rosetta Stone of forbidden science. The analysis conducted with technology that didn't exist in 1971 confirmed that its genetic code was unlike anything ever seen. It contained sequences that appeared to be non-human, but also sequences that were so perfectly mathematically structured that they looked artificial, as if the generations of inbreeding hadn't just been a random chaotic process. It was as if someone or something had been guiding it. The report speculated that the family's rotation system wasn't their own invention. It was a formula, a complex genetic algorithm they had been following meticulously for over a century. A set of instructions passed down from a source they could no longer remember. All designed to produce one specific outcome. The child wasn't an accident of incest. It was the result of an experiment. An experiment in creating a bridge between what we are and something else. The final page of the declassified report is where the story turns from a historical anomaly into a present-day horror. It's a single memorandum written by the lead investigator from the Office of Genetic Security addressed to a director whose name is redacted. It reads, "The Whitaker case represents a potential paradigm shift in our understanding of genetic manipulation. The family's breeding program was not random. It followed a clear prescriptive pattern. The level of organization and long-term planning suggests an external influence or a pre-existing doctrine of unknown origin. The successful creation of the anomalous fetus hereafter designated subject culmination indicates that this doctrine is not theoretical. It is a functional methodology for creating non-standard biological entities using human genetic stock. The primary question is no longer how this happened but why. And more importantly, the Whitaker clan cannot be presumed to be the only instance of such a program. Further investigation is recommended to identify other isolated communities in regions like Appalachia, the Ozarks, and remote parts of the Pacific Northwest to determine if similar parallel experiments are currently underway. That recommendation was officially denied. The case was closed. The investigation never happened, at least not one that was ever entered into the official record. They found something in the mountains of Virginia that terrified them. They saw the result of a plan so old and so patient that it defied comprehension, and they decided that the safest thing to do was to look away. So what were they building? What was the purpose of the perfect circle? The family believed they were creating a messiah, a being of pure blood that would possess abilities beyond our understanding. But the government report hints at something darker. It suggests the Whiters weren't the scientists. They were the she-lab rats. That their fanatical ideology was a form of control. A story fed to them to ensure their cooperation in an experiment they didn't even know they were a part of. But who was the experimenter? The journals of Joshua Whittaker, the founder, speak of a visitor who came to him in the mountains, a man with eyes like polished stones who gave him the sacred laws of blood. Was this a madman's delusion or the beginning of a chain of command that stretched back into the shadows of history? The symbols the family used, the spiral patterns found on their stones and in the final impossible posture of the child are not random. They are ancient, predating most known civilizations. They are symbols associated with fringe archaeological theories about pre-human intelligence, about beings who may have seeded life on this planet and left behind a hidden instruction manual for its evolution. A manual someone found, a manual someone is still using. The story of Sarah Mae Whittaker isn't just about the horrors of incest. It's about the terrifying possibility that human history and human genetics might not be our own. That we exist within a program, a grand and patient experiment. And every now and then, in the dark and forgotten corners of the world, the results are born. The Whittaker compound is gone now. The state finally claimed the land for a national park in the late 1990s. The cabins were bulldozed, the woods allowed to reclaim the scarred earth. There is no marker, no plaque, nothing to indicate the century of secrets that unfolded there. To any hiker passing through, it is just another peaceful, beautiful stretch of Appalachian wilderness. At some of the park rangers who patrol that specific area tell stories. They talk about a strange silence that hangs over the old Whittaker land, a place where the birds don't sing and the insects don't buzz. They report equipment malfunctions, compasses that spin wildly, GPS devices that lose their signal. And a few, when speaking late at night and off the record, will admit to seeing things. A tall figure watching from the reach line, a pair of pale yellow eyes glowing in the darkness. They dismiss it as tricks of the light or local folklore seeping into their imaginations. They have to, because the alternative, the idea that something is still out there, that the experiment wasn't a failure, but merely one more step, that the bloodline didn't die, but simply moved on, is too monstrous to contemplate. The silence in those woods is not the silence of peace. It is the silence of anticipation. The silence of something holding its breath, waiting to be born again. The most disturbing real-world quote comes not from a government file, but from a geneticist. Drive. J. Robert Oppenheimer, the father of the atomic bomb, a man who understood the terror of unlocking a new power. After witnessing the first atomic test, he famously quoted the Bhagavad Gita. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." But in a private letter, he wrote something else, something far more cryptic and chilling. He wrote, "We have tampered with the deepest architecture of matter. There are echoes in the architecture of life itself. I fear we have awakened something that was meant to sleep." He was talking about atomic energy, but the metaphor resonates with a terrifying clarity. The Whittaker family, whether by madness or by design, tampered with the deepest architecture of life. They twisted and warped it, following a blueprint they barely understood. And for 6 days, they awakened something that our world was not ready for. The agents who came and erased the child from existence were not acting out of malice. They were acting out of fear. The same fear Oppenheimer felt. The fear that comes when you open a door and realize you have absolutely no idea what is on the other side. They didn't bury the truth to hide a crime. They buried it to protect us from a knowledge that we are not equipped to handle. The knowledge that the human form is not a final draft. It is merely a template, and templates can be rewritten. A whispered historical rumor has persisted for centuries in the more isolated parts of Appalachia. It's a story the locals tell about the Hollowern or the Mishildren. They say that not all the families who went deep into the mountains in the 18th and 19th centuries were simple settlers. Some were following a different call. They were members of ancient pre-Christian European sects who fled the Old World to continue their practices in secret. These practices revolved around bloodlines, around the belief that specific genetic pairings could over many generations produce a being that was not entirely human, a vessel capable of communicating with the old gods or the earth itself. The stories say these families would seek out the most isolated valleys, the most inaccessible hollows, and begin the great work. They would cut themselves off from the world and turn inward. Their family trees becoming tangled knots just like the Whiters. Most of these experiments, the legend goes, ended in madness and extinction. The bloodlines collapsing under the weight of genetic decay. But every few generations a family would succeed. It would produce a hollow child. A child that didn't cry, that had strange eyes, and that could, according to the whispers, command the animals of the forest and speak to the wind. These children were seen as prophets, as living gods. The story of the Whiters is not an anomaly. It is simply the only time the outside world ever got a glimpse. The story shifts now from the past to a chilling possibility in the present. Think about the rise of private genetic companies. The billionaire tech moguls obsessed with life extension, transhumanism, and hacking the human code. They pour billions of dollars into research that happens far from public oversight on private islands and in underground laboratories. They are driven by the belief that human evolution is too slow, too random, that it can be improved, directed, and perfected. They are in their own way doing exactly what Joshua Whittaker set out to do. But they are not using religious fervor and isolation as their tools. They are using CRISPR gene editing technology, artificial wombs and artificial intelligence to model and direct genetic outcomes. They are writing a new gospel not in a leather-bound journal but in lines of code. What if the Whittaker experiment wasn't the end of something but the beginning? A crude analog prototype for a new digital and far more efficient program. What if the knowledge that the government tried to bury in 1971 wasn't lost, but found, snatched up by powerful, shadowy figures who saw not a horror, but a blueprint, a proof of concept? The true terror is not that a family in the mountains created a monster. The true terror is that they proved it was possible. And now the people trying to do it again have infinitely more power, more resources, and more reasons to hide their work from the world. Let's return to the child for a moment. To the 6 days it spent in that incubator at Mercy General. The declassified file contains a single grainy black and white photograph that was somehow missed in the initial confiscation. It was taken by Nurse Patricia Williams with a small personal camera on the 4th day. The image is blurry, distorted by the curved glass of the incubator. But you can see it. You can see the impossible form, the oversized translucent head, the twisted limbs, and you can see the eyes. Even in the poor quality photo, the eyes are clear. Dozens of them across the 3 faces, all staring directly at the camera, staring directly at you. There is an intelligence in that gaze. It is not the vacant look of a deformed infant. It is the ancient, weary, and profoundly intelligent gaze of something that knows, something that has seen things we cannot imagine. This wasn't a child. It was a visitor. A biological probe sent from a place we do not know through a gateway built of human flesh and blood. Its brief tragic life was not a failure. It was a message. And its silent screaming faces were trying to tell us something. What did it see? What did it know? We have the photograph, the records, the eyewitness accounts. We have all the pieces, but we are looking at them with human eyes trying to solve a puzzle that was not made for a human mind. The final gut punch realization isn't in the files. It's in the negative space. It's in the questions that nobody asked. When the authorities demanded to know who the father was, every adult male in the Whittaker family, her father, her uncle, her grandfather, even her own brother claimed responsibility, not out of shame, but out of pride. The official story is that they were all culpable, all part of the systematic incest. But what if it was something else? What if they genuinely didn't know? In the family's own journals, the concept of a single father for a culmination child was considered impossible. They believed such a child was not the product of one man, but the focused ancestral will of the entire bloodline. They believed the child was fathered by the family itself. A collective impregnation. Medically, that's impossible. It's the talk of a delusional cult. But the child in that incubator was also impossible. Its DNA was impossible. Its survival for 6 days was impossible. At what point do we stop applying our rules to a phenomenon that so clearly operates outside of them? The authorities, the government, they closed the case because they found a neat, tidy box to put it in. A tragic story of abuse and incest in an isolated community. It's a horrible story, but it's an understandable one. It's a human one. But the truth, the real truth that they saw and buried is that what happened in that delivery room wasn't human at all. What were we never meant to know? That the Whitaker family was not unique. The declassified file contained a heavily redacted appendix listing other family names, other remote locations, a farm in the Ozarks in the 1930s where an entire family of 12 simply vanished overnight. A small isolated island community off the coast of Maine where for 50 years no children were born and then suddenly 7 women gave birth on the same day to infants who all died within hours. All displaying similar though less extreme genetic anomalies. A commune in the deserts of New Mexico that worshipped a strange geometric deity and practiced ritualistic breeding before. The entire compound was mysteriously destroyed by a wildfire in the 1980s, leaving no survivors. The Whitaker case wasn't an isolated incident. It was just the one that got out. It was the one where the experiment, for one reason or another, was pushed too far too fast and broke containment. We are living in a country on a planet that is seeded with these secret patient experiments. Little pockets of humanity being cultivated like rare orchids for a purpose we can only guess at. They are the control groups in an experiment so vast, so ancient that we cannot even see the walls of the laboratory. Can you imagine that? To be born into a life that is not your own. To be a single link in a chain. Your only purpose to forge the next one stronger and stranger than yourself. Your body, your love, your children, not yours, but tools for a project that began centuries before you were born and will continue long after you are gone. This was the reality for Sarah Mae Whitaker. Was she a victim or a willing participant? Did she feel horror at what she was carrying or a kind of religious ecstasy? The records are silent on her inner life. She is a ghost in her own story, a vessel. Her humanity erased by the monstrosity of her purpose. But for a moment, let's try to see her. A 17-year-old girl, her body wasting away, feeling that alien pulse inside her, surrounded by the fervent, hopeful faces of her family. Did she ever, in the dead of night, wish she could just run away, escape down the mountain and see the world she was taught was a corrupt and evil place? Did she ever dream of a normal life, a normal child, or was her mind so completely colonized by the family's ideology that she truly believed she was a handmaiden to a god? We will never know. Her voice was silenced, first by her family, then by the thing in her womb, and finally by the government that buried her story. She is the ultimate victim, a human sacrifice on the altar of a terrible hidden science. You are not just watching this, you are becoming part of it. By learning this story, you are breaking the seal. The silence that was so carefully constructed for 50 years is now broken. The knowledge is out and it changes things. The world feels a little thinner now, doesn't it? The shadows in those old forgotten places feel a little deeper. The idea that we are alone, that we are the masters of our own genetic destiny seems a little more fragile. The story of Sarah Mae Whitaker is a virus of thought. Once you are exposed, you can't unknow it. You start to see the patterns. You look at the fringes of society, the strange cults, the isolated communities, the billionaire bunkers, and you wonder who else is tending a secret garden. Who else is following a sacred blueprint? The world is full of locked rooms, and we just handed you the key to one of them. What you do with that knowledge is up to you, but you can't pretend you don't have it anymore. You are a witness now, just like Dr. Powell, just like Nurse Williams. You have seen what was born in that room. And that makes you a guardian of the secret. A secret that some people would still kill to protect. The final layer is this. The child didn't just die. The medical records, the ones that were seized, contained one last entry from Dr. Powell written in a shaky hand just moments after the child's death before the agents arrived. It was a single sentence underlined 3 times. Body temperature is rising post-mortem. This is a biological impossibility. When life ceases, the body cools. It's the immutable law of thermodynamics. But the Whitaker child was different. For nearly an hour after its heart stopped, its body temperature continued to climb from 98.6 to 105 to 110 degrees until the sensitive monitoring equipment in the incubator simply shorted out. A nurse who touched the glass of the incubator with her bare hand suffered secondary burns. What was happening inside that small twisted body? It wasn't decomposition. It was some other process, a final, energetic transformation. As if its death was not an end, but a trigger, a release of all the concentrated twisted potential that had been built up over 5 generations of forbidden pairings. It arrived as a biological entity, but it may have left as something else entirely. A burst of data, a psychic signal, a seed planted back into the world, invisible and undetectable, waiting for the right conditions to grow again. The story has been told, the file is open. From the dark obsessions of Joshua Whitaker in a lonely mountain cabin to the sterile horror of a government cover-up. From a family tree that became a suffocating knot to a child that was born from its center, a living, breathing impossibility. For over 200 years, the Whitakers worked in shadow, convinced they were creating a divine being. What they really created was a keyhole. And for 6 days in a small Virginia hospital, the entire world was visible through it. We saw a glimpse of a plan so vast and patient it defies human imagination. A program that may be running still in the quiet, forgotten places where the blood is kept pure and the old rules are still followed. The silence you might feel when this is over is the echo of the silence in that delivery room. The unease is the feeling that the door once opened can never truly be closed again.